Two people sit down to the same task and put in exactly the same effort. One of them walks away sharper and more capable than before, and the other walks away drained and no better than when they started. The work was identical. The number of hours was identical. The result was the opposite. And the thing that separated them was not talent, and it was not discipline. It was a belief. Specifically, a belief about what effort is for, and about what a mistake means when it happens. Here is what makes this strange. The belief in question is often invisible to the person holding it. Nobody wakes up and decides, in so many words, that ability is a fixed quantity they were issued at birth. But they act as if they had decided exactly that, and the acting shapes the outcome. Two students can face the same hard problem. One reads the difficulty as information about the problem. The other reads it as a verdict about themselves. The problem has not changed. The consequences could not be more different. This is the question almost nobody asks about effort. Why does the same amount of it make one person smarter and leave another person merely exhausted? We tend to treat effort as a single thing, a fuel you either supply or withhold. But effort does not act on its own. It acts through an interpretation. And the interpretation is set by a belief that most people never examine, because they do not know it is there. Carol Dweck spent a career examining it. She holds the Lewis and Virginia Eaton Professorship of Psychology at Stanford University, and her central contribution to psychology is a distinction she first introduced in a research paper in 2006 book called Mindset. The distinction is between two implicit theories a person can hold about their own abilities. One theory says intelligence and talent are basically fixed, a hand you were dealt. The other says they are malleable, something that develops with effort and strategy over time. Dweck calls the first a fixed mindset and the second a growth mindset. The word implicit matters, because these are not opinions people debate. They are assumptions that sit underneath behavior and quietly decide how a person responds when things get hard. Mindset stops at the level of encouragement. Believe in yourself. Effort matters. Never give up. That version is easy to dismiss, and it deserves to be, because it is not a mechanism. It is a poster. Underneath the poster there is an actual system, and the system has been studied in classrooms, in laboratories, and in the electrical activity of the brain in the half second after a person makes a mistake. What follows is that system. We are going to look at three mechanisms, and then the honest version is more useful than the poster and also more interesting. The first mechanism is this. The belief about ability sets the goal, and the goal decides the behavior. This is the part Dweck and her colleague Ellen Leggett described in that 1988 paper in the journal Psychological Review. Their model proposed that a person's underlying assumptions about themselves get translated into goals, and that those goals then generate whole patterns of behavior. In their words, as individual self-attributes are translated into allied goals. That sounds abstract until you follow it into a real situation. Suppose you believe ability is fixed. Then every task that tests that ability is, whether you want it to be or not, a measurement. A hard problem is not a chance to get better. It is an exam on a quantity you cannot change. Under that belief, the rational goal is to look capable and avoid looking incapable. Psychologists call this a performance goal. You want to demonstrate the ability you have, and above all you want to avoid any becomes dangerous, because if you try hard and still fail, the failure points directly at the fixed quantity. Effort, under a fixed belief, is evidence against you. This is why some of the most capable people quietly arrange their lives so that they are never fully tested. If ability is fixed, and effort could expose its limit, then the safest move is to hold something back, to keep an excuse in reach, to choose the task you already know you can do. There is a familiar pattern here, giving yourself a reason to fail in advance, and from the outside it looks. A fixed belief makes an untested reputation feel more valuable than a real skill, because the untested reputation can never be disproven. The cost is that the skill never actually develops, and the person comes to mistake the avoidance for a personality. Now suppose you believe ability is malleable. The same hard problem means something completely different. It is not a measurement of a fixed quantity. It is the specific activity through which the quantity grows. Under that belief, the rational goal is not Psychologists call this a learning goal. Effort is no longer a threat, because effort is the mechanism. A mistake is no longer a verdict, because a mistake is where the information is. The same event, the same difficulty, gets read two opposite ways depending on a belief the person may not even know they hold. You can see the two readings in something as ordinary as a person who says they are bad at languages. Under a fixed belief, that sentence is a fact about a permanent limit, and it settles the matter. There is no point in the effort, because the effort only leads to embarrassment in front of a ceiling that will not move. Under a malleable belief, the same sentence is a description of a current position, not a life sentence. Bad at it right now means early in the process, which is exactly where every person is bad at everything. The words can be identical. The future they produce is not, because one of them closes a door and the other one describes a starting line. You can watch this split happen in children. In a set of 6 studies published in 1998 by Claudia Müller and Carol Dweck in the Journal of Personality and Social, praised in one of two ways. Some were praised for their intelligence. Some were praised for their effort. That was the entire manipulation. What happened next was measured carefully, and the results were consistent across all 6 studies. The children praised for intelligence came to care more about performance goals than about learning goals, compared with the children praised for effort. After they hit failure, the intelligence-praised children showed less persistence on the task, reported less enjoyment of it, were more likely to attribute their struggle to low ability, and actually performed worse than the children who had been praised for effort. And when asked about intelligence itself, the children praised for intelligence were more likely to describe it as a fixed trait, while the children praised for hard work were more likely to say it could be improved. Sit with the size of that. A single difference in how the praise was worded moved children toward a fixed theory of their own ability, and that theory then changed how they behaved in the face of difficulty. The praise did not just make them feel a certain way in the moment. It installed an assumption, and the assumption did the damage later, when the problems got hard. This is the first mechanism in a sentence. What you believe about ability decides what you are trying to do, and what you are trying to do decides what you do when it gets difficult. And notice that neither group of children was told anything false. The ones praised for intelligence were, presumably, intelligent. The praise was accurate. It was also, as a piece of instruction about how the world works, quietly misleading because it pointed at a trait instead of at the actions that had produced the result. Accuracy and usefulness are not the same thing. True about themselves and still hand them a worse theory of how to improve, because what a person needs from feedback is not a verdict on who they are but a map of what to do again. The second mechanism is where this stops being a story about attitude and becomes a story about the brain. If a growth belief and a fixed belief really produce different behavior after a mistake, then somewhere in the moment right after the mistake, the two kinds of people must be doing something different. That moment is very short. And it turns out you can measure it. When a person makes an error on a task, the brain produces a sequence of electrical responses that can be recorded from the scalp. 2 of these are well studied. One happens almost immediately, a fast automatic signal that something went wrong. The second comes a little later and is called the error positivity, usually written as the PE. The PE is understood to reflect conscious attention to the mistake, the brain actually turning toward the error and allocating attention to it rather than flinching away. In 2011, Jason Moser, Hans Schroeder, Carrie Heater, Tim Moran, and Exhau Lee published a study on mindset. They measured people's beliefs about intelligence, then recorded their brain activity while they made mistakes on a demanding task. What they found is one of the cleaner pieces of evidence in this whole area. A growth mindset was associated with a larger PE, that later signal of attention to the mistake. In other words, people who believed ability was malleable showed a bigger brain response of turning toward their errors. And those same people showed better accuracy on the trials right after a mistake. They corrected more effectively. The most important part is the link between the two. The researchers found that the size of the PE statistically accounted for the relationship between mindset and accuracy after a mistake. That is a careful way of saying that the belief did not improve performance by magic. It improved performance by changing what the brain did with the error, specifically by increasing attention to it, and that increased attention was what carried through into better correction. The belief, the brain response, and the behavior lined up into a single chain. This is a correlational finding, not a lever you can pull directly, and it is one study rather than a settled law. But it points at something concrete. The difference between a growth and a fixed response to failure is not only a feeling. It is visible in the half-second after the error, in whether the brain leans in or turns away. Consider why this would matter so much over time. A mistake is the single richest source of information you get while learning anything. It tells you exactly where your current model of the task is wrong. If your response to a mistake is to attend to it, examine it, and adjust, then every error becomes a small correction to your future behavior. If your response to a mistake is to look away from it, because the mistake feels like evidence of a fixed limit you would rather not confront, then the information in the error is lost. Two people can make the same number of mistakes and extract completely different amounts of learning from them, and the difference compounds. Over a semester, over a career, the gap between leaning in and turning away becomes enormous, and it started as a belief about what the mistake meant. It is worth being precise about what attention to a mistake actually involves, because it is not comfortable. Turning toward an error means holding the unpleasant, doing what the fixed response does, which is to end the discomfort as quickly as possible by looking away, moving on, or explaining the error into something that was not really your fault. The growth response is not more pleasant in the moment. In some ways it is less pleasant, because it means staying with the evidence of a failure a little longer than you want to. What it buys is the information inside the failure. And the reason this can be practiced rather than simply wished for is that the choice is small and it repeats. Every error is a fresh chance to lean in by 1 degree instead of turning, is what accumulates into what people later call talent. The third mechanism is about where these beliefs come from, and it closes the loop back to the first. If a fixed belief is so costly, why do so many people hold it? The answer is that it is taught, and it is often taught by praise that was meant kindly. Go back to the Mueller and Dweck finding, but look at it from the other direction. Telling a child they are smart sounds like the most supportive thing you can say. But think about what it teaches. It says that the success just achieved is evidence of a trait, a quality the child has. That feels wonderful when the child succeeds. The problem arrives at the next failure. If success proved you had the trait, then failure, by the same logic, proves you lack it. Praise for the person makes the person the thing being measured, and once the person is the thing being measured, every setback becomes a threat to the self, not a problem to be solved. Praise for the process does the opposite. When you praise the effort, the strategy, the persistence, you are telling the child that the thing that produced the success was something they did, and something they can do again. Success and failure both become information about actions, not verdicts about worth. This is why the wording of feedback is not a cosmetic choice. It installs a theory. And the theory, once installed, runs quietly for years, shaping which challenges a person takes on and which they avoid, how they read their own mistakes, and whether effort feels like a path or a confession. The self-model is doing the work here. The brain maintains a picture of who you are and what you are capable of, and it defends that picture. If the picture says intelligence is fixed and you have a certain amount of it, then a hard failure is not just unpleasant. It is a contradiction of the self-model, and the mind will do a great deal to avoid that contradiction, including avoiding the very challenges that would help you grow. In ordinary life, this defense rarely announces itself as fear. It shows up as a sudden loss of interest in something you were struggling with. It shows up as a very reasonable decision that this was never really your area. It shows up as the phrase "I am just not a math person," or a science person, or a creative person, which sounds like self-knowledge and often works as an exit. The self-model would rather conclude that the door was never worth opening than admit the door is hard and stay at it. None of this feels like avoidance from the inside. It feels like discovering a fact about yourself. That is precisely what makes a fixed belief so good at protecting itself, and so expensive over a lifetime of small quiet exits, each one perfectly reasonable on its own. The payoff of getting the belief right shows up over real time in real schools. In a study published in 2007 by Lisa Blackwell, Callie Trzesniewski followed 373 seventh graders across the 2 years of junior high school. They measured each student's implicit theory of intelligence at the start. The result was a clean divergence. Students who believed intelligence is malleable showed an upward trajectory in their math grades over those 2 years. Students who believed intelligence is fixed showed a flat trajectory. Same school, same curriculum, same 2 years, and the grades pulled apart along the line of a belief the students had walked in with. Then the research ran an intervention. In a second study, they taught one group of 7th graders that intelligence is malleable, that the brain gets stronger with use, while a control group was taught study skills without that message. The students who received the malleable intelligence teaching showed positive change in their classroom motivation. And the grades followed. The control group continued a downward slide in achievement that was already underway. For the group taught the growth message, that decline was reversed. Changing the belief changed the trajectory. That is a stronger claim than a correlation, because they intervened and watched the outcome move. At this point the story sounds almost too clean, and this is exactly where an honest treatment has to slow down. Because if you only heard what I have told you so far, you would walk away believing that a growth mindset is a reliable, powerful lever that turns struggling students into thriving ones. The best independent evidence says something more careful than that, and the careful version is the one worth knowing. In 2018, a team led by Victoria Sisk, with Alexander Burgoyne, Jingza Sun, Jennifer Butler, and Brooke McNamara, published 2 meta-analyses in psychological science. A meta-analysis pulls together many separate studies to see what the overall pattern really is, which is the right tool for a question like this, because any single study can mislead. The first of their analyses gathered 273 studies covering more than 360,000 people, and it asked how strongly a person's mindset actually relates to their academic achievement. The second gathered the intervention studies, the ones that tried to change mindset and measure the effect, covering more than 50,000 people. Their headline result was sobering for the enthusiasts. Overall, the effects were weak. The average relationship between mindset and achievement was small, and the average effect of mindset interventions on achievement was small. But they found something inside the average that matters enormously. The effects were not evenly spread. The students who did benefit from mindset interventions were, in particular, students with low socioeconomic status or students who were academically at risk. In other words, the lever is weak on average across everyone, and stronger for the specific people who are struggling and under-resourced. The average hides the structure. A tool that does little for a secure, high-achieving student can still do meaningful work for a student who is close to falling off. That is almost exactly what the largest and most careful test of the idea then found. In 2019, David Yeager and a large group of collaborators published a study in the journal Nature that ran a growth mindset intervention as a national experiment in a nationally representative sample of students across the United States. The intervention was deliberately minimal. It was short. Teach that intellectual abilities can be developed. The finding was specific and honest. The intervention improved grades among lower-achieving students, and it increased how many students enrolled in advanced mathematics courses. It did not transform everyone. It moved the students most likely to be moved. And there was one more finding in that study that is easy to miss and important to keep. The effect depended on the environment. The intervention changed grades when the peer norms in the school aligned with its message. Reasonable, the seed took. Where it did not, the same seed did much less. A belief planted in a hostile field does not grow just because it is a good belief. Context is not a footnote to the mechanism. It is part of the mechanism. This is the place for a plain statement, because the topic warrants it. Nothing here is advice about your education or anyone else's, and a belief about ability is one input among many that include teaching, resources, health, circumstance, and a great deal of luck. Mindset is not a cure, and treating it as one does real harm, because it quietly implies that a struggling student simply failed to believe hard enough. That is not what the evidence says. The evidence says mindset is a real but bounded lever, most useful for specific people in supportive conditions, and useless as a substitute for actual teaching and actual resources. So what is left standing after the honest accounting? Quite a lot, actually, and it is more usable precisely because it is not oversold. The first mechanism holds. What you believe about ability shapes the goal you pursue, and a goal of looking capable behaves very differently from a goal of becoming capable. You can notice which one you are running. When you avoid a challenge because you might look bad, that is a performance goal steering. When you take on a challenge because you might learn something, that is a learning goal steering. You cannot always choose how you feel, but you can often notice which goal is driving and question it. That noticing is not a trick that dissolves the fear. It is only a wedge. But a wedge is enough, because once you can see that avoidance is a goal choosing for you rather than a fact about the task, the choice becomes visible, and a visible choice is one you can make differently the next time. The second mechanism holds. The moment after a mistake is where learning either happens or does not, and the difference is whether you attend to the error or flinch from it. This is not about feeling good about mistakes. It is about the concrete act of turning toward the specific information a mistake contains, examining exactly what went wrong, and adjusting. The people who rebound better are not the ones who mind their mistakes less. They are the ones who look at them more. It is less about how quickly you stop making mistakes and more about what you do in the seconds right after each one. The fast learner and the slow learner are often making very similar errors. The difference is in the attention that follows the error, and attention is a thing you have some say over. The third mechanism holds, and it is the most immediately practical. The feedback you give, to a child, to a colleague, to yourself, installs a theory. Praise aimed at the person teaches that outcomes measure a fixed trait. You can repeat. This is not about inflating anyone with empty encouragement. It is the opposite. It is about being specific. Not you are so smart, but you found a good approach there. Not you are gifted at this, but that improved because of how you practiced it. Specific process feedback is both more honest and more useful, and over time it builds the belief that effort and strategy are where results come from, because that is in fact where they come from. And this is the one mechanism you can apply today, without waiting for anything or anyone. The next time you go to praise someone, or to narrate a result to yourself, you can aim the sentence at the process instead of at the person. It costs nothing. It is more truthful. And over enough repetitions it teaches the only theory that keeps a person willing to attempt hard things, which is that attempting hard things is how a person becomes able to do them. And the honest accounting itself is a kind of practical wisdom. Mindset is a multiplier, not an engine. It does its best work on top of good teaching, real effort, and a supportive environment. That is not a disappointing conclusion. It is a precise one, and precise is what lets you actually use a thing instead of just admiring it. Here is what is worth carrying out of all this. Underneath the effort you supply to anything, there is a quieter layer you rarely inspect, a set of assumptions about what that effort can and cannot change. That layer was mostly installed by other people, through years of praise and correction and offhand comments, long before you could evaluate it. And it is running right now, deciding for you which difficulties are worth entering and which mistakes are worth examining. You did not choose most of it. But unlike your talents, which are only partly yours to move, the belief about your talents is a thing you can actually look at, question, and slowly rebuild. That is the real finding under the poster. Not that believing in yourself makes you succeed. It does not, on its own, and pretending otherwise is cruel to the people it fails. The real finding is smaller and sturdier. The belief you hold about whether ability can grow changes what you do with effort and what you do with failure, and those two things, repeated across years, add up to a great deal. The belief is upstream of the effort. And the belief, unlike almost everything else in this picture, is something you are allowed to change. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I would genuinely like to read your answer. Think of one ability you have quietly decided you do not have. Not something you have never tried, but something you concluded, at some point, was just not you. What is the belief sitting underneath that conclusion, and can you remember where it came from? Tell me in the comments, because the origin is you. In the next video we turn from the beliefs inside your head to the pressure coming from outside it. There is a set of psychological triggers that can move a person to say yes before they have consciously decided anything, and they work on almost everyone, including the people who are certain they are immune. That is the subject of influence, and it is where we go next.